So, can I say a very warm welcome to everybody this afternoon? And we're absolutely delighted to have John Dale with us from the Sheffield Occupational Health Advisory Service. Just a few things before I introduce John properly. A warm welcome to everybody, as well as a whole lot of people who've joined us on Zoom. Delighted to welcome everybody who's watching us on our Facebook page. As with all of our online talks, we encourage you to, if you want to put any questions that you would like me to put on your behalf to John. Please put those in the Zoom chat or on the Facebook page, and I will pick those up and I might process some of them, I might shorten some of them, but we'll try and do our very best to cover everything that's raised and pass that on to John after he's done his main talk and presentation. We're very keen that, as well as questions, you actually might want to add some thoughts in the chat on Facebook or Zoom about some of the reasonable adjustments or some of the things that have actually worked for you that have been really helpful and positive. Because sharing ideas among people who are facing some similar hurdles is always the most useful information. So please put any positive comments about things that have worked for you or things that you've requested as well. And that will be really useful. I'm hoping that at the end of this session, we can actually gather some of the best ideas and some of the answers to the questions put today. And we'll turn that into maybe an article for our magazine or something on our website or a handout. We will do something with this information. So just to briefly remind you, the session is recorded. We will be able to watch it later on YouTube if you don't manage to stay the whole course, or if you know other people who might be interested. The only thing you'll see on YouTube is the person speaking, which is either myself or John Dale. Nobody else will be seen. So it doesn't matter whether you have your camera on or off. It's entirely up to you. So yeah. So without further ado, let me, the last thing I was going to say is if you do ask questions, we're not in a position to kind of deal with somebody's very individual circumstances. So please ask questions that are going to be, of interest or relevant to a wider group of people. If you need one-to-one advice, then we need to look at making that happen either with SOAS if you're in the Sheffield area or elsewhere. So without further ado, a very, very warm welcome to John Dale. John Dale is an occupational health advisor for the Sheffield Occupational Health Advisory Service. And John's going to share some slides with us. But I just wondered, do you want to just say something very briefly about SOHAS, the Occupational Health Advisory Service, which is quite a special service, isn't it? We're very lucky to have that in the city. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all this afternoon. As you say, Carolyn, Sheffield Occupational Health Advisory Service is unique in the country. It was set up 40 years ago by a group of local GPs and trade unionists to provide support to the thousands of people in Sheffield at that time who experienced work-related ill health and who weren't really getting support anywhere else in the health and social care system. At that time, of course, there was lots of steel works, coal mines, cutlery works, engineering, all with their own hazards. And most of those industries have now gone. But the issues of ill health and work, of course, continue. And these days, our service is very much more geared towards trying to support those who have ongoing health problems to remain at work or to return to work with the adjustments at work that they require. And what we're discussing this afternoon that's of concern to you all, of course, is the issue of chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, which has an overlap with fibromyalgia and long COVID, although these are all different conditions, but there are certain similarities. And it's very interesting from my point of view, having worked in the area of occupational health for over 40 years now, that there is more understanding of these conditions than there was. Now, that may come as a surprise to you. You may well say, well, there seems to be an awful lot of misunderstanding, both within the medical profession, at work, and in society in general. And that is certainly still the case. But take it from me at my stage of my working life that there is more understanding now of the sorts of measures that can be supportive. So I'm going to try and put some slides up. I'm afraid I'm not a graphic designer, so there's nothing very exciting to look at, but it will just help me to go through this this system. So this is what we're talking about. And the layout I can see hasn't worked very well, but never mind. And the immediate issue is to move the slides on. And Carolyn, I may need to ask you to help me there.
Okay, you should be able to just click the next slide by on your laptop keyboard. You should have a right hand,
I should
up, down, right, and left, and the right hand one should work, or the up, down one should work.
Here we go. I've done something. That's clicked it.
You've done something.
So what we're talking about are surprisingly common conditions. Don't need to dwell on the figures, but you can see the best part of 1,000 people in 10,000 experience some sorts of symptoms like that. Obviously, there's an overlap between these three conditions, so it's probably a bit less than that. We don't need to dwell on the figures, but I just want to say that we're talking about something that affects quite a lot of people during working life. And that's an important point because it can feel extremely isolating and a very lonely place to be, to have a chronic condition that doesn't seem to be responding to any conventional medical treatment and which is having a massive impact on daily life. It can feel as though you're the only person in this situation and nobody else understands, but there should be a wider understanding because these are not uncommon problems. And the sorts of symptoms, I don't need to tell you, chronic fatigue, brain fog, shortness of breath, palpitations, stomach, bowel problems, muscle aches, anxiety, and of course, post-exertional malaise, exhaustion after very mild exertion. So this is what we really want to be speaking about this afternoon now. How do these problems affect work, and then what can be done at work to make it possible for someone to remain in work or return to work? Now, of course, fatigue, a manager may typically think about how tiring their job might be, how tiring the job they are wanting somebody to do might be, but we need to remind or inform the manager that long before someone has sat or stood at their workplace, there's a whole process of getting up in the morning, getting ready to leave the home, travel, as well as the physical and mental exertion involved in the job. And then brain fog, impaired concentration, impaired short-term memory, possibly long-term memory, more often short-term, of course, has a massive impact on any work that requires organization of tasks, relating to other people, both colleagues, maybe customers, maybe managers, maybe people who a manager might be managing. And then shortness of breath. Many jobs involve speaking. And sorry, I just went forward there, but never mind. Involves speaking, teaching, for example, sales work, call center work. All of that can be difficult with shortness of breath. And of course, on physical exertion, that gets worse too. Carrying on this list, palpitations and linked perhaps dizziness can have a serious impact on driving. There are safety critical issues if working at height or with moving machinery, near hot surfaces, near open water. All these are issues to be taken into consideration. And then anyone who needs to get to a toilet quickly, perhaps with a degree of urgency, first of all needs ready access to a toilet, but also supposing that person is responsible for the safety or welfare of others. A teacher can't necessarily just walk out of a classroom at a moment's notice and leave an unattended class if there's no other adult in the room. Likewise, a health worker who is perhaps doing treatment or conducting procedures, working in an operating theatre even. Muscle aches, I think clearly worse after physical exertion, but the impact of pain on concentration needs to be taken into account. And of course, how long can someone do anything before having to stop is an important issue for deciding what type of work, what adjustments may be needed. And all these factors, of course, are going to create anxiety if anxiety isn't already there as a result of experiencing long-term ill health, which it almost certainly is. But there's the additional anxieties of how can I manage at work? What sort of expectations are going to be made of me? And this can impact self-confidence and reduce motivation, particularly if mood falls and one gets depressed. Now, the thing about chronic fatigue syndrome, of course, is that it's not a fixed condition. Maybe for some people, but for many people, it can vary from day to day. And as we've already mentioned, post-exertional malaise can have a big impact on how things vary from day to day. And the unpredictability of this is going to have an impact on how the employer expects the employee to function and what the employee, the worker, is actually managing to do. And of course, trying to avoid the boom and bust of overwork one day and then collapse and inability to work at all the following day, or even the following days, is the goal, to reach a happy medium where the employee is managing to do enough work to satisfy the employer, but not so much as to make it impossible for them to continue. And that is not something that can be predicted in advance very often. It's sometimes a matter of trial and error, but trying, of course, to build up from an achievable minimal level and building to a sustainable level. So finally, in this list of how these conditions affect work and the sort of discussions that need to take place for a return to work or remaining at work. First of all, discussing what can be done rather than concentrating on what can't be. It's very easy to identify, for managers perhaps, to identify what can't be done. But from an employee's point of view and their occupational health advisor, it's important to stress the positive. What's on offer here? What can be provided at work by someone experiencing this long-term condition? And then what adjustments at work are needed to enable this contribution to work to continue. So, very often this starts with discussion about a gradual, or sometimes referred to as a phased return to work. And that doesn't just mean a gradual build-up of time, but let's start with time. A manager quite often might recognize quickly that someone is not fit for their full-time contracted duties and say, well, how about coming back, or how about starting back 2 or 3 days a week? And it sounds as though that's quite a good offer, but in fact, a full day is almost always much too much for anybody with chronic fatigue syndrome. And I would always advise starting with much less than a full day. And that might mean looking at a later start time, recognizing the longer time necessary to get ready, to leave the home, or even if working at home, still a longer time that's necessary to get up in the morning, to allow for rests while dressing, breakfasting, and everything else. And an earlier finishing time. And of course, if there is any travel involved, starting later and finishing earlier can help to avoid rush hour travel, which is always more tiring than off-peak hours. And longer breaks, but more importantly, more frequent breaks are going to be needed as well. In fact, it's much more useful usually to have frequent short breaks than an occasional long break. But all of this needs to be discussed with the individual employee, yourself, to work out what is going to be most suitable for you. But a gradual or phased return is not just looking at shorter working time to begin with, and then perhaps working out a way of slowly increasing that. It's also about looking at the duties involved. Most people's jobs involve a variety of different duties, not all, of course, some are very repetitive. But there are usually some duties that are going to be less demanding of energy and perhaps less of mental concentration than others. And those are the duties, the less taxing duties, that should be started with. Again, thinking about brain fog, concentration, impairment, and so on, starting with the most repetitive and least demanding duties is what I would normally advise. And of course, looking at the workload, the speed of work, the amount of work that's expected. If someone might normally be turning out, I don't know, 10 phone calls in a morning, maybe starting with 3 or something along those lines would be an appropriate adjustment. And there may be equipment that would help, that needs to be provided. For example, perhaps lifting equipment that takes the physical load off the upper limbs, or perhaps software, for example, voice-activated software to avoid or reduce the use of a keyboard. Looking at alternative work or an alternative workplace may be necessary if the pre-illness work can't be sufficiently adjusted. Flexibility is important, and in line with that, a brief discussion at the end of each week with the manager. You know, how are things going? What have been the good things this week? What have been the difficulties? What can we plan for next week? The supportive manager taking this approach will be very helpful. And then longer term periodic reviews through an occupational health service may be useful to give further advice as needed to management. So what are the rights that an employee has in this sort of situation? Well, there's the, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to click that. Can we Can we go back a slide, Carolyn? I'm not sure that I've worked out how to do that yet.
Sorry, it has to be you doing it. I don't have control over your slideshow.
No.
So again, where your up-down keys are, there should be a
No,
left.
yeah, there we go. So all employees are covered by employment law, which means an employer cannot just dismiss someone on a whim, providing that someone is first of all an employee. And it's not always so straightforward if, in this world of the gig economy, 0-hour contracts, bogus self-employment and so on. And also an employee does need 2 years continuous experience to be covered by full employment rights. Whether that changes after the general election, we will see, but at the moment, that's the situation. The Health and Safety at Work Act puts a responsibility on all employers to provide a safe workplace and to do risk assessments, safety risk assessments. And that includes, where appropriate, perhaps a stress risk assessment. As I said right at the very beginning, the hazards at work are much less these days those of heavy industry and much more issues like stress in the workplace. But the employer still has a responsibility to conduct risk assessments and then take measures to reduce the risks as much as is possible. Now, the Equality Act is perhaps the most important one in our situation here. The Equality Act makes it illegal for anyone, and particularly an employer, to discriminate on the grounds of disability. But the Act does not define what disability is. It says that a long-term, by which it means more than 12 months, or likely to last more than 12 months, substantial impairment of normal daily activities is to be regarded as a disability. But that's not a medical definition, that's a legal definition. And the consequence is that doctors or other health professionals can't diagnose a disability, apart from a handful of exceptions. It's a legal body, normally an employment tribunal or higher court, that decides whether someone with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or long COVID has a disability or not. But nobody wants to go to a tribunal if that can be avoided. And so an employer will normally ask for advice from an occupational health service, where they have one or use one, and the occupational health physician or nurse will give an opinion on disability and whether the Equality Act applies. But it is only an opinion. They can't actually definitively say. But most employers, having asked for advice, should take it when it's been given and not question that if they've been advised that someone does have a disability. And then having been advised that, does then have a responsibility to make reasonable adjustments. Now, what are reasonable adjustments? That too is not defined in the Equality Act. And what would be reasonable for a large employer like a hospital trust, an NHS trust, university, a major telecoms company, or a major supermarket, would not be considered reasonable for uh, a little company that's got an office above a shop somewhere and 3 people working in it, or a corner shop, or a very small business like that, that clearly has far fewer resources to make adjustments. The comparison is with a so-called reasonable employer of similar type, and that again can only be done by an employment tribunal. But as I've just said, nobody wants to go to a tribunal if it can be avoided. And by getting appropriate advice, hopefully employers make the necessary adjustments. Sometimes they can be helped to make these adjustments by access to work. Now, access to work is a government scheme that will pay employers to make adjustments at work where these are necessary to support an employee with a disability. So that could include physical adjustments to the workplace. It could include the purchase and installation of appropriate software and then the training of someone to use that software. It could take the form of providing a taxi to get to and from work if that would enable someone to continue working, whereas the physical exertion of traveling by public transport or driving and parking, having to park half a mile away from the office, if that would make it impossible for someone to continue working. So access to work can be a very useful scheme, and further information, I'll give the link at the end. It's on the gov.uk website. So I've mentioned occupational health advice a few times. Half of the UK workforce don't have access to an occupational health service at work. Most big employers, quite a lot of medium-sized ones, will have access to an occupational health service that they use regularly. At one time, many of these would have been in-house, apart from the NHS, Network Rail, and a handful of others. There are few in-house occupational health services these days. Most employers purchase or have a contract with an outside provider. But there are clearly very many people who don't have access to occupational health through their work. Now, for those who live or work in Sheffield, my own service, which is funded mostly now by the City Council's public health budget, is available to all. But I appreciate that there'll be many people in this meeting now who perhaps don't find themselves anywhere near Sheffield, and I'm afraid there aren't similar services in most parts of the country now. Now, supposing there has to be a reduction in working hours, there may need to be some financial adjustments, and the question of benefits may need to be looked at. I'm not going to spend more time on this, Carolyn, but I could perhaps come back if there are questions on it. So here are some links. You'll be able to see these afterwards. And I think I'm going to finish at that point and see if there are any questions that are coming in. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. That's a really, really helpful kind of walk through of the whole context of this. I'm wondering whether you'd be happy to stop sharing your screen, and then we can progress with questions and answers. I've got loads and loads of questions already, so feel free to ask more, but I'm trying to kind of combine questions where I think they're covering the same sorts of things. The most lively little bit in our Zoom chat in the last kind of 5 minutes has been around access to work. And I was just going to say something very briefly about our experience in the Sheffield ME and Fibromyalgia group, which is that we have found access to work incredibly helpful. They will sit down with you and talk through what might be useful to help you in your work. Obviously, a lot of our work is online, on screen, so they won't provide people with the basic tools for work, like a laptop, because your employer should provide that. But they will provide, if they think it's useful, they will provide things like a second monitor so that it's at the right height. They will provide sit-stand desks, which cost a lot of money, but they will provide them completely. They will provide the right chair for you. They will also provide software and software training. So things like Dragon software, which helps with note-taking and writing. It means instead of writing documents, you can speak them and record them, and all sorts of things like that. So somebody, I've missed the name, I need to find the name. Somebody has asked about things like software for planning documents. Is that Louise and various people, other people I think have asked. Access to Work will have that conversation with you. They will know what to recommend, and they will provide it, and they will also set it up, and they will provide you with training if you need. So please don't hesitate. Access to Work in South Yorkshire have something, I can't remember the figure, it was around 62 million or something to spend on supporting people with chronic illness and disability to stay and work. So it's easier to get access to work than it is to get PIP. You're not assessed, you just talk about what you need or what you find useful. So I cannot emphasize strongly enough how good they are. It's probably something, you know, who knows whether that system is going to stay, but it's there at the moment. So I don't know whether you want to add anything else about access to work, John, but we found them great.
Yeah, can I just add, I agree with you that, you know, it is very useful, and certainly they should always be approached. Sometimes there is a bit of a backlog, as with all government departments, and it can therefore be worth contacting them fairly early, perhaps before a return to work, but they will usually want some sort of date in mind for a return to work before they actually put things into place. But you know, if someone was, say, thinking of returning to work next Monday, it would have been better to have approached access to work, you know, a month or two ago, rather than on Tuesday morning. because it might still take a couple of months for them to get things going, depending on what the adjustments are, of course.
Okay, so reinforced message of don't hesitate to contact Access to Work, and yeah, they do have a level of expertise, so they can help you navigate your way through different sorts of software and what would work. So there's been a couple of questions from a couple of people, Cheryl and Sarah, about the whole recruitment process. So when you go through the recruitment process, you don't mention, my understanding is that you don't mention your particular needs, special needs that you might have until after you've been offered the job. I think this then, please, say whether you think that is or isn't correct. And then when you're going through a kind of probationary period, how do you manage this? Because I think some people are feeling that that's been used against them.
Yes, very important question, and I'm afraid completely omitted to talk about that earlier. You're quite right, Carolyn, that there's no requirement to mention any health condition or any form of disability at the recruitment stage, unless, of course, you may need some adjustments actually during that recruitment. For example, if the procedure involved some sort of practical test that was going to be quite physically demanding, and which could be done by the applicant with some adjustments, obviously relating to a job as well that could be done with some adjustments, then those adjustments need to be asked before the procedure begins. It's always a difficult one because there are some types of work which clearly there are very limited scope for adjustments. You know, everybody would think of something like a firefighter, someone who has to carry out very heavy activity in a limited space of time. But there are a whole number of other types of work which do involve some physical exertion, but where there is scope for adjustments. And also for concentration, you know, where some adjustments to allow longer to carry out particular tasks. So it's appropriate to ask for adjustments if they're needed during that selection process. Once the job has been offered to the best person, and hopefully that's you, the applicant, then the employer's duties and responsibilities under the Equality Act continue. They can't withdraw their offer on finding that some adjustments may be necessary. But they're under no obligation to make any adjustments if they don't know that they would be required. So if you don't tell the employer that adjustments are necessary, and they can't tell obviously by looking at you, they don't have to make any adjustments. So some sort of discussion is needed at that point then. And when it comes to probation, you know, for a longer period may be needed for probation, or a different type of induction process, procedure, that needs to be discussed, and maybe the employer needs to seek some occupational health advice on how best to provide those adjustments.
Thank you. There's been a number of comments, particularly through the Zoom chat, but about when that advice is given, it's like, what is the leverage to get your employer to actually follow some of the advice that is given to you? And somebody else has made the point that, you know, their employer feels like they just want to push into the dismissal process and not actually go through trying to find solutions. Obviously, people have mentioned the importance of trade unions here, but yeah, it's Lucy who's saying, my employer wants to move to a dismissal meeting on the grounds of ill health capability, but they're just not taking on board this advice. What is the leverage?
Yeah. Again, it depends on the size of the employer and the support within the organization. With a large employer where there should be more scope for adjustments at work, maybe redeployment, alternative duties, work from home, a whole range of possible adjustments depending on the nature of the job. It would be unreasonable for them to move towards dismissal without exploring properly these different alternatives. And certainly it can be very important and very useful to have the support from a trade union that is used to the way that employer works in going through these discussions and stages. In a very small company, it may be much more difficult. There may not be very many alternatives. And I was talking to somebody yesterday, he didn't have chronic fatigue, but supposing he had have done, he was a window fitter, working with 2 or 3 other guys, fitting windows. Well, very difficult in that situation to make adjustments, and things could move forward quite quickly to dismissal. So there's no hard and fast answer. Certainly, I'd always advise someone to be in a union where possible, and to push back against an employer who seems to be moving quickly towards dismissal. But the measure of what is reasonable in the end is in the hands of an employment tribunal. Actually, there's one other body I haven't mentioned, that's my omission, and that, of course, is ACAS, the Government Arbitration Conciliation Advisory Service, ACAS, easily found on gov.uk, or just put in ACAS, and they can give helpful advice on what is reasonable for an employer to do. Thanks. That answers that.
Thank you. And just to clarify, under the Equality Act legislation, even if you're on a probationary period, which means that you know, within that period, either side can kind of mutually agree that it's not working. But the Equality Act comes into play, doesn't it? So so even if you haven't sort of been there long enough to get the usual employment rights that a non-disabled person would have, you get a special protection under the Equality Act, and that kicks in from day one, doesn't it?
Absolutely right. Standard employment rights come in after 2 years continuous employment, but it's illegal to discriminate on the grounds of disability from day one. But if the employer doesn't know about the disability, and there's no way that they could have known unless they were told, they don't have to make any adjustments. So again, it comes back to having a discussion about the adjustments that may be needed. And again, coming back to that earlier slide I put up, concentrating on what can be done rather than what can't be done helps to frame this discussion in a sort of optimistic and positive light.
Thank you. And that leads us into another question. Well, I haven't put down the name of who's asked it, but I think at least two people have asked it, which is about how you kind of talk with your colleagues about what's going on for you, and how you get them kind of on side with you so that they don't feel, oh, they're getting special treatment and all sorts of reasonable adjustments, and we're just getting dumped with all the work. So how do you manage that team working? Do you have any comments?
That's such a good question, and it comes up an awful lot. And understandably, people, everyone will feel a bit uncomfortable, if not downright anxious, at work, if they feel, well, I'm coming in at 10 o'clock in the morning and going home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I've done a quarter of what the person sat next to me who's there from 8 till 5 or whatever. These are discussions which are not necessarily easy when you don't know the people involved. Much easier if you've been at work for some time, you've got friends there or colleagues who, mutually supportive. Then unfortunately, someone develops chronic fatigue, or maybe has a flare-up after a long time that they've been reasonably well, a relapse. I don't think there's any hard and fast rule that I can give advice on. Discussing what one's health is never particularly comfortable or easy for many people. But if colleagues don't have any understanding, then misunderstandings inevitably do arise. Depending on the nature of the organization, it sometimes can be very helpful if there's say a team meeting for a manager to arrange to have an outside speaker to come and talk about a particular condition. I'm not sure if that's something that your group does, Carolyn, at all, but I know that there are some groups around the country, I think, who would go into a workplace, perhaps provide resources, leaflets, slides, maybe a talk, something that can give everyone a better understanding. But clearly, again, it's inevitable that even if it's done anonymously, someone is going to be identified. So it has to be something that they would like to happen, something that they're happy to have happen. There's no hard and fast answer, but discussing these things is almost always better than covering them up.
And finding, mutual support amongst other people, either within your organization, because there may be other people in the same position as you, or indeed in other organizations. It almost kind of feels like if there was some informal network of people who were managing in work, but wanting that kind of mutual support, it just helps give you a bit of confidence, doesn't it? And a sense that you have the right to actually explain this. One of the little things in the chat just mentioned was around wearing the hidden disability sunflower lanyards, which some people might feel confident to wear, others might not. And somebody's mentioned a reasonable adjustment passport. Is that something that you know about?
Large employers often have something like a reasonable adjustment passport and also a disability support group. the universities that I deal with, the civil service, large civil service offices, I know they have disabled employees self-support groups that can be helpful in discussing issues like these and pointing how maybe one part of a large organization has successfully supported someone, that perhaps another part of that same organization could benefit from that experience. And the disability passport is something along those lines, basically a record of helpful adjustments that someone can take with them if they move from one particular team or area of a large organization to another. It won't work outside that particular employer. It might help, but it's not going to carry any weight. But within an employer that has, many different areas of work, think of a hospital, for example, dozens of different offices, hundreds of different work areas, to move from one to another might be very useful to have something like that to save going through exactly the same discussions with every single manager again.
Yeah. The Wendy, thank you for prompting us. Actually, Access to Work will also pay for workplace and team training, which is very helpful around, it could be around ME, CFS, it could be around ADHD, it could be around all sorts of different things. But they will actually fund team training. Getting your team to do it might be another issue, but there is that possibility. If people wanted our group to come out and talk to teams or employment in situations, then we would certainly consider that. Kind of depends what we were asked to do, when and where, and whether we could do it or not, but certainly very happy to be asked to do that. Okay. There's Dan and Joy have raised about one of the things that can really trigger symptoms can be chemical sensitivities, volatile organic compounds, etc. So there's kind of two things. One is what's required in your workplace. It might be the cleaning products or whatever that actually set your symptoms off. But the other could be just what your colleagues are wearing. And so do you have any thoughts or comments on how to manage those situations?
Yes, good question. And comes down to a safety risk assessment, which should include ventilation for a start. And that's important also from the point of view of reducing the risk of infection, where people work closely together, sharing each other's air, as we found out at great cost in the pandemic. Ventilation, workplace ventilation, is a key issue that is often completely neglected. So that would probably be the easiest way, or the first way perhaps, of looking at how to reduce exposure to particular chemicals at work, looking at the ventilation, extraction of air, supply of fresh air, and so on. Clearly, if someone's work involves handling particular chemicals, and you mentioned cleaning chemicals there, if your job is a cleaner, it's less easy to avoid these chemicals than if your job is going into somewhere that was cleaned a few hours earlier and where windows have been opened and there's a good supply of air gone through. So that's where specific individual advice may be needed. What colleagues wear, again, less of a problem in a well-ventilated workplace. Many workplaces aren't well ventilated. I think very tactful discussion is necessary when it comes to what other people wear and don't wear. Sometimes moving a work station can be helpful, moving nearer to an open window or an open door. There again, temperature can come into things as well, to sit in a cold draft or just underneath a cold air conditioning outlet is not very comfortable for anyone. But those are the specific sorts of issues that need to be looked at.
Okay, thank you. Let me just see. Jan asked earlier whether do we have a template for stress risk assessment?
The Health and Safety Executive have got a template for that, which is on their website. There's an awful lot of quite helpful resources on the Health and Safety Executive website. Just look up HSE stress and you'll find an awful lot, including a template for a risk assessment.
Thank you. That's really a really helpful pointer, and we'll try and put all the links that you've posed and put up and any additional ones together, and we'll put on our website or whatever document we produce from this. Advice on reducing hours. So some employers, in order to reduce hours to manage either a flare-up or potentially a deterioration in condition, employers advise using holiday allowances or whatever. So there's two things really. One is like how to do that. Does it have to be at the cost to the employee? But the second thing, which I thought was really interesting as well, is if you kind of reduce your tasks or share them out differently amongst your colleagues, your teams, you reach the point where you could start to reduce your kind of career progression possibilities. So it's how to get that balance between making work possible and not actually being so disadvantaged against all your colleagues that you never get the opportunities to progress.
Yeah, and there isn't really an easy answer to that one. First of all, on the use of holidays to reduce working hours, I usually advise against that because people need holidays even when they're working shorter hours, especially people everybody needs a break from work, but people who've got families want to enjoy time with their family when the rest of the family's on holiday and so on. So it's not really a solution to sacrifice one's annual leave in order to reduce working hours. Sometimes for a short period of time, it might be unavoidable, but it's not a long-term solution.
Okay. So it's short-term, long-term perspective. So yeah. Okay, thank you. What else have we got for questions? Yeah, phased return to work is something, I mean, you've touched on as well, and the idea that maybe you need a kind of longer phased return to work. Is there any more kind of detail that you think it would be helpful for people to ask for or think about when negotiating a phased return to work after a period of absence?
Yes, an employer will usually expect a phased return to work to be something like 4 weeks, possibly 6 weeks, which might be fine if you're returning to work after elective surgery, a simple broken limb or something like that. But it's usually quite inappropriate, insufficient for someone with chronic fatigue and many other chronic conditions, but particularly chronic fatigue, where the return may need to extend very much longer. And the difficulty usually is that it's not possible to say how long it should return. It should extend when someone is returning. It's a case of, let's see how we get on. And that's where building a periodic occupational health review into the discussion can be helpful, so that there's some sort of target perhaps to begin with, shall we say, over a 6-week period, perhaps to build up to working 15 hours a week. That's a purely arbitrary figure. It's, everyone is going to be different. And then to have a review. Someone who's on a full-time contract, 35, 37 hours a week, whatever, is not going to find their employer willing to continue paying full-time hours for much shorter hours worked for long. It depends usually on the, I would say usually on the strength of the trade union as to how long they can make that last for. But sooner or later, even the most supportive employer is going to say, look, you're managing 20 hours. We can't carry on paying you for 37. And if 20 is the maximum, then perhaps PIP, other benefits may be of some help. Probably not nearly as much help as getting that pay coming in. And that's one of the very bad ways in which people experiencing long-term health problems and disabilities get treated.
Yeah. And Keith makes the point as well with small employers, the challenge in trying to accommodate people who are not for a period of time able to reliably, repeatably perform work tasks. So it is a challenge for small employers especially. Okay, could we just touch very briefly on fit notes, and then I think we're going to probably pretty much wind up. I think I've covered most of the issues raised, even if the word for word questions haven't been exactly how they were posed. Fit notes, GPs or associate healthcare professionals and all the other who do these. A fit note is actually kind of that you are fit to return to some sort of work, or because it's not actually about being fit to return to your specific job, is it? Is there anything about how that works that people need to be aware of?
Yes, the GP can, or whoever's filling it in now, the other health professional, can say on the fit note that someone is unfit for work, or that they're fit for work, or that they may be fit for work with amended duties. And then there's space to give a few comments and expand on that. Most GPs neither have the time nor the experience of workplace issues to put down more than a few words of what amended duties might be like. They might put down something like needs a phased return or needs more regular breaks, but they're not going to add much more than that. And so the need for some further occupational health advice is something that an employer will often be looking for. And we've already gone into how they might find that. It can help the GP and make the fit note more useful if the patient in this situation, in other words, yourselves, can actually suggest to the GP some useful things they could put on that note. So trying to write your own fit note, rather than just leave it to the GP, is something the GP will probably welcome, and the employer, the manager, may well find more helpful. So I would take an active role in getting that fit note written and say, you know, the way I'm feeling, I think I could probably make a start back to work after Easter, but I think I'm going to need these sorts of adjustments, you know, starting perhaps 3 hours a day, gradually building up, and not lifting heavy boxes. Something that you think your employer might be able to sort out. The GP can put down a bit more detail there, and you know, they may both thank you for that.
Okay, so yeah, take control of some of the narrative then around your needs, and particularly by advising your GP on what goes on the fit note. So what I kind of picked up from today, you've very clearly made the point that the conversations with work needs to, as much as possible, focus on the things that you can do and the things that you're good at, so that your employer is constantly thinking positive things about you. And then the requests for special needs are in the context of the things that you are good at and can be valued for. I hope that doesn't come across as a kind of over positive story, because I understand how incredibly difficult this is for people, and very difficult for people to stay in work. And we have family experience of all this. So yeah, a bit worried about people all using their holidays to reduce hours, because you'll need holidays to help you get through the year. And but the crucial thing is that your health is so important, and if it's really, really doing very bad things to your health at work, then maybe somebody's mentioned the Craig David song of "I'm Walking Away." But maybe that's the kind of the thing to do to sustain your health for a period of time, and then look to get back into work. So I hope you've come away with some sense of some really, really practical and useful advice from John, but also some real sense through the chat discussions that you are not alone. There's a lot of other people who are in similar positions, and please be in touch with us at the Sheffield ME Fibromyalgia Group. You can email us info@sheffieldmegroup.co.uk, and watch this space. We will produce something from today's talk, and I would love you to very, very briefly say in our meeting chat whether you have found this talk useful, and whether you found this format useful of how we've been doing it. So it's really useful for us to get feedback and to learn how to do these things better. But an enormous, big thanks to John Dale for coming and talking us through what's a difficult subject and a distressing subject as well, because I know people are so struggling to manage to juggle being in work and manage their own health. So that's really a difficult one. So thank you very much to John.
And thank you to you all. And Carolyn, if you could just save the chat and send it to me, I would like to read the comments and feedback. I haven't had a chance to be reading as the meeting's gone on, but I will read them afterwards. Thank you.
We can certainly do that. So this talk will be, we have a recording of this talk. Our lovely office team, including Emma, will be doing a little bit of a edit, front end and back end, and then we'll be posting it up on our YouTube channel and on our website for you to find again. So we'll let everybody know where to find the talk again. So thank you all. Thank you to everybody for coming. I know not everybody was Sheffield, so thank you, Dorset, and everybody else who's been here. We look forward to seeing you on future talks. Please look out for them. So cheers.